And we expect that probably in the Pacific region, there are around 1,000 species of wild bees, which is kind of mind-boggling.
It is.
That's a lot. It's 1,000
Yeah.
different species out there visiting all sorts of wild, different species of flowering plants in these complex networks in all different ecosystems. And so the refuge system commissioned us essentially for a 5-year project to go back into Pacific region refuges and outside of refuges as well, to continue this inventory and monitoring program.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Master Melittologist, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services manages this huge network of public lands and waters that are called the National Wildlife Refuge System. With more than 570 refuges spanning the country, this system is protecting some of the most iconic species of plants and animals and provides some of the best opportunities for the public to view this wildlife, probably anywhere in the world. Now, there are bees on the refuges, and there have been past attempts in our region, which is Region 1, that includes Washington and Oregon and Idaho, to monitor and inventory those bees, but there's a new effort with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service working in partnership with Oregon State University to do a renewed inventory and monitoring. And I'm joined by the two principals of that project. Lincoln Best is the taxonomist with the Oregon Bee Atlas here at Oregon State University. And August Jackson is been hired on to coordinate this partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In this episode, we're going to hear about the first year of the results, how volunteer master melittologists are playing a role for the first time in doing this kind of work, and what the horizon for this inventory monitoring effort is. It goes actually for 5 years, the agreement. And so what are the prospects moving forward? It's a real exciting episode. I hope you enjoy this week on PolliNation. From just down the hallway, welcome Link and August.
Good afternoon.
Oh, I
Thank
suppose
you.
it is. Not quite.
No, it's
Not
not.
quite.
On the cusp. It's great to have you both here. I think this is a topic that a lot of our volunteers know about in the Master Melittologist program, but maybe people in the Pacific Northwest don't know about this National Wildlife Monitoring Inventory and Monitoring Program for bees. Maybe just to begin with, August, what is a National Wildlife Refuge, and is there a kind of typical look to a refuge?
Yeah, well, thanks, Antoni. This is a really exciting project to be a part of. And National Wildlife Refuges don't exactly have a typical look because they cover a lot of different lands. So this program for inventory and monitoring is for Pacific Region 1 refuges, which in our case includes Washington, Idaho, a little chunk of Nevada, and of course, Oregon. And so in Oregon, there's some wildlife refuges that people are rather familiar with. In the Willamette Valley here, we have a few like Finley and Ankeny. And Ankeny, for example, is fairly small. I don't know the exact size, but it's certainly in the low thousands of acres, if that. Whereas if we look to southeastern Oregon, a place like Heart Mountain, it's an extraordinarily large refuge that is completely dedicated to really the conservation of antelope, pronghorn antelope. So you have refuges that are set up and managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife System that are dedicated to the conservation of animals and plants, but some of them are really focused on specific animals, maybe like waterfowl in some instances, or antelope in other instances. And so it's a really kind of complex system. And one of the things that was really striking to me when we began working with the refuges is just how relatively small the staffing is for some of these really large refuges too. So you have, 3 or 4 staff for the size of Rhode Island, right? Which was really interesting to me. I always expected it was a bit more kind of a sprawling organization, but it's really not. A lot of these folks are kind of out there on their own doing work out there. So it's been great working with the folks at the refuges, with the biologists and the project managers, and getting to know some of the work that they do.
Thanks, August. I guess, Link, you're the lead on this project, and I get you were aware that there had been previous efforts to survey on the refuges in our region, Region 1. Can you tell us a little bit about that effort and why was it important to revisit monitoring this region?
Absolutely. So we're really fortunate to have retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife biologist Joe Engler working with us closely for the last 2 years through our Oregon Bee Atlas effort. And while Joe was with the service, he, as part of his duties, conducted inventory and monitoring of wild bee biodiversity in Pacific refuges and probably beyond. From around 2011 to 2017 was the bulk of his effort, and they did that surveying with pan traps. And so Joe kind of oversaw that program. He was their primary taxonomist, and they had a lot of the local refuge biologists taking part doing putting the traps out and collecting the specimens and preserving them, and they produced tens of thousands of bee specimens over that period, which provided a great milestone or baseline for hundreds and hundreds of bee species throughout this, quite large region. And we expect that probably in the Pacific region, there are around 1,000 species of wild bees, which is kind of mind-boggling.
It is.
That's a lot. It's 1,000
Yeah.
different species out there visiting all sorts of wild different species of flowering plants in these complex networks in all different ecosystems. And so the refuge system commissioned us essentially for a 5-year project to go back into Pacific region refuges and outside of refuges as well to continue this inventory and monitoring program. Um, and so we are now, of course, in a few dozen refuges of the 100 or so in the Pacific region. And we are working to add information to what Joe and colleagues found originally. So, pan traps allow you to document a species at a location and time. And of course, what we're doing is adding that floral component to those bee occurrences and those bee population occurrences, which really adds a lot of rich data that we hope to leverage in future analyses.
Actually, for some of our listeners, this idea of a pan trap versus netting might be a little obscure. What are you talking about?
Sure. So pan traps have been used for probably around 30 years as a popular method for catching bees. And so there's a variety of different pan traps that people use. The Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab on the East Coast with Sam Droege et al. They use a smaller souffle cup. So it's about this wide in diameter and it's about this deep. And you can either put soapy water or glycol in the trap. So both of them break the surface tension. So if an insect, which is attracted to this fluorescent bowl,
Uh huh.
if an insect lands on the liquid,
Yeah.
because the surface tension will break, they will fall into the liquid, drown, and then you can collect all of your traps and pour them through a strainer and then preserve those specimens in some container with ethanol. And this has been a popular way to survey bees and other insects for a few decades now. They're very productive. And so for the amount of effort that's required to put them out and add the liquid and then return, 1 to 3 days later and sift out all the insects, you get a quite a good take for the investment in time. Whereas through the Master Melittologist program, training that allows individuals to take part in the Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and beyond Atlas initiatives, we train people to use just a butterfly net to sample bees visiting flowers and document those flowers. And so Those netted samples don't produce this as copious of volume of individual specimens, but they do have that really, really rich data component, which is that association with that flowering plant.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that clarification. And I guess it raises, this new initiative is being this transition from, what Joe Engler was doing with these pan traps, getting this inventory of insects to this new data set that's going to be assembled by master melittologists. Maybe tell us a little bit more, Link, this project that you've conceived of. How are master melittologists going to be involved? I mean, when Joe did it as an employee, he would go out and he would presumably, drive around. And how is it going to be different with master melittologists sort of at the fore of the collection effort?
So, through the Master Melittologist program, we train all of these public participants to conduct these survey efforts. And so we train them all online, we provide field training, and once everyone's trained up, we can send them out into the field to conduct their field work on our behalf. And so in this initiative through the Pacific Region 1 National Wildlife Refuge Inventory and Monitoring Program for wild bees, we are taking this, highly experienced, trained up group of individuals that live all over the Pacific Northwest region, and we are sending them into the national wildlife refuges and adjacent refuges and similar habitats to conduct this survey effort. And the benefit of that is that it provides a lot more labor than can really be supported by any kind of agency program or academic program or, nonprofit. And so, through the Master Melittologist program, I think we've enrolled 5 or 600 individuals. And so really over the last 6 years, we've built up this huge amount of public expertise, public engagement, and a public desire to actually take part in these survey efforts because it's really rewarding for the public. They get to go on these adventures and expeditions into the coolest parts of the Pacific Northwest, into these this a system of protected areas that have frequently really interesting ecosystems and plant communities. They get to discover and document all of these wild bee species, and often they get to make scientific discoveries, which is really rewarding, and it creates this legacy both for the agencies, but also for all of the individuals collaborating and contributing their time, effort, and expertise to this effort.
Thanks, Link. Maybe just to continue on that, August, you're the person who's training and coordinating all of these master melittologists as they get out to refuges. What is this system? Like, how are you preparing them to work on refuges and coordinate their efforts? Tell us a little bit about that workflow and I know that you really this got set up really quickly in the spring. So I imagine a lot of this year has been dedicated to figuring out how this is going to work.
Yeah, so we got started last spring, had a meeting with some of the refuge biologists, gave them a presentation about program, and then immediately jumped into obtaining permits. And so we went through this process of obtaining permits from about 15 different refuges around the Pacific region. And so that took time. And once we had the permits ready, we were really kind of ready to send some of our master melittologists out onto the refuges. And there's not too much additional training for many of these folks who have been at it for years now. The main additional training kind of revolves around these special conditions of access for these national wildlife refuges, because again, these are preserved lands that are dedicated to the conservation of animals. Oftentimes they have nesting birds that are rare or threatened that we want to avoid. They're really conscious of bringing in invasive species, of fires potentially starting. So, some different training aspects of what do you need to know before you go onto a refuge and what do you need to have with you. And some of that shifts seasonally as well. So we developed a section, kind of a little module on Canvas, which is where all of the master melittologist trainings take place, that just provided some of this information, provided all of the special use permits, the conditions of access, and then we had a quiz to make sure that folks read it all. if they're interested in collecting on a refuge. And then there's a refuge visit request form as well. So if anyone wants to visit a refuge, they can fill out that request form that goes to me, and then I can kind of arrange access to the specific refuge that they want to visit. So it's a lot of kind of coordinating moving parts. The great thing is once things are rolling for a season, it tends to be pretty simple. So once we got all the permits in place, everything moved pretty smoothly. And it's really just about getting people excited to go out and visit some of these places, which is not too hard to do because many of them are just, really gorgeous, incredible scenery. A lot of our members, the Master Melittologists, are interested in bees, but they're also interested in plants, birds, other wildlife. And so these refuges are just great places to take a vacation and catch some bees.
Well, it did have a first year, and I know there's a report that we'll have linked in the show notes of that first year. Tell us, August, what were some of the, how'd this first year go? What were some of the highlights?
Yeah, so 38 master melittologists collected bees on a dozen refuges across the Pacific Northwest, and that amounted to over 2,100 bee specimens, which, felt like a good start in year one. We definitely want to bump that effort up in year two, but that gave us a really kind of good beginning look at some of the species that we'd be dealing with in these refuges in year one. And we also got a bit of a late start to year one. So we got our first permits in place in May. So that means in some of these refuges, at least at the lower elevations, we missed a bit of that spring bloom. So we missed some of the bee fauna. So we're really excited to kind of go into this year, this second year, and get into these refuges earlier. Of course, we're having a long winter this year and a slow start to spring. So that gives us a little bit more time to get all our permits renewed and in place. But there was some really neat discoveries in the first year. So one of my favorite ones is Rick Williams, a longtime volunteer master melittologist who lives in the Bend area, went out to Malheur with his wife to do some birding in May and collected some bees off of willow blooming along kind of the Central Patrol Road, which is a great spot for birding from the car. And he caught what's known as one of these red-tailed dialictus. So it's a group of kind of dually metallic green sweat bees that have a red abdomen. And those are most frequently found kind of in drier areas. Malheur is a drier area, but they're more diverse into the Great Basin in the Southwest. And he ended up collecting Lasioglossum testaceum, which is a new species record for the state of Oregon. And the nearest record that I could locate is in Wyoming, about 500 miles away. So a pretty, big
Wow,
range
that's
expansion,
amazing.
which is, it's neat. Often when we're finding new state records, their nearest records are typically a little bit closer to us, but it's certainly not the first one of 500 miles or more that we found. And in that same trip, he caught some interesting little mine bees, Andrena illinoisensis, which are have been rarely collected by the program, pretty infrequently collected historically in the state. There are a ton. I could go on and on. There are a ton of neat finds. So I'll just share a couple more really quickly. Carol Yamada, another really long time volunteer from Portland, on a trip out to Hart Mountain in June, collected Western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, and that is the first record from Hart Mountain. And this species is bumblebee species that has been petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. So finding it in new places is interesting and exciting. It's also been found on the nearby Steens Mountain, so it seems like these kind of Sky Island desert mountains offer some pretty good habitat. So that was a great find. And then more locally in the Willamette Valley here, just 20 miles up the highway from where we are now, Leanna Dickerson caught Xenoglossodes pomenae at Ankeny National Wildlife Refuge. And that bee is a specialist on tarweed in the genus Madia, particularly Madia elegans, which is this more showy tarweed that blooms early in the morning, closes up midday, and then often starts blooming again a little bit in the evening. This is a bee that is only known from a few localities in the state so far. So finding it in the Willamette Valley in a National Wildlife Refuge is pretty neat. They've been doing a lot of prairie restoration in these units with prescribed burning, reseeding, And tarweed is a plant that they targeted for a lot of the reseeding. And it's cool to find that species there. And I'm sure we'll find more of it. You just have to get up early before a lot of other bees are active.
This is great, and it's a real testament to sort of the stewardship on the refuges to be able to, on a very quick pass, find all sorts of bees that, may have not been known to the area. It does raise, this is, as I understand, Link, this is a 5-year agreement, so there's more to come. What are your goals going into the second year and beyond?
Yeah, a lot of my interests are related to just the data. And so one of our responsibilities is to review the historical data that Joe and colleagues produced. There's a lot of it. So as I mentioned, they produced tens of thousands of records, and this provides documentation for where populations of all these hundreds of different bees reside. So our data will also provide basic distributional data that will kind of augment or be added to these known distributions for these hundreds and hundreds of species. Again, with the benefit of having that floral data component as well. And so, using all of this data, one of the things we're working towards and is solving kind of one of the big problems in inventory and monitoring of insects, but especially of our, many thousands of wild bee species in North America. And that is this issue of detection. And so historically we've conducted programs similar to these two, the historical effort and this contemporary effort, where we go out and we document many, many different species. We put out traps, we dig through the trap samples, and we document all of these species. But we have this challenge, especially when reconciling petitioned or listed species, that in order to understand one species in particular, we don't go out and document all species at once. And so there's a bunch of trade-offs there. And so what we're going to do with our historical and contemporary data is create some optimization equations where we use all of this available information to create models for the different species with the floral relations built in, because many of these bees will only occur where their preferred or special plant is found, like in the example that August gave of this longhorn bee specialized on Madia elegans. We will not find that bee outside of where its floral host is found. So we can include both the distributional data for the flowering plant and for the bee, or in the case of bees that, have a suite of plants that they are frequently found on, we can use all of this information to come up with species specific protocols of how to find known populations and identify areas to survey for new populations of these individual species. And so that's one of our longer term goals for this project.
So I suppose that then allows for much more precise monitor or actual monitoring, where you would say it should be here, and we do find it here, and that sort of is an indicator of the health of that plant community. But on the contrary, if you don't find it there, then it suggests something might be going wrong, I suppose.
That's a possibility, but ultimately for, if we think we have around 800 species in Oregon alone, and if we have 800, the Pacific region likely has more than 1,000 species. One of the challenges is that at least two-thirds and maybe three-quarters of those species are actually relatively rare or very rare. It's easy to find the common and widespread species, so we don't really have to worry about them. They're easy to detect in a survey effort. The challenge we have is with these other several hundred species, which are very difficult to find, and often you just kind of trip over them rather than being able to predictably find them or detect them in the landscape. And so we are going to use our data to basically come up with an empirical basis and a probability and a likelihood of being able to detect these things where we know they should be, but also where they're likely to occur. And these are testable hypotheses where we could create a detection model for something that's relatively uncommon, and then we can go out to where a population should be found, and we can use the methods necessary to detect it. So looking on the right kind of plant at the right time of year in the right location, and we should have a high likelihood of detecting populations we have never found before. And these are all testable, and so we're going to do that.
This is great. This is a really wonderful initiative, and I imagine people are going to want to know about year 2. We'll look forward to having you both back on the show. Thanks for telling us about this, and just a reminder to those who are watching that you can take a look at this really nicely laid out report in the show notes. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Adoni.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.